A lonely millionaire found a lost boy in the woods and took him to her mansion. One day, arriving home earlier than usual, she was shocked by what she saw. The sun was setting over the imposing walls of the Thompson estate, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens and the marble fountain adorning the main entrance. Inside those stone and glass walls, Emily Thompson watched the sunset from the window of her study, a glass of red wine in hand, and her gaze lost on the horizon. At 35, Emily was the very image of success. Her perfectly styled black hair framed a face with delicate but firm features. Her designer suit and high heels spoke of power and sophistication. However, her brown eyes, usually bright and astute, reflected a deep melancholy. "Miss Emily," Carmen's voice, the housekeeper, interrupted her thoughts. "Dinner is served." Emily turned slowly, nodding with an almost imperceptible gesture. "Thank you, Carmen, I'll be down in a moment." When the door closed, Emily sighed deeply. Another day, another lonely dinner in the grand dining room. Her gaze fell on a photograph on her desk, herself, much younger, smiling, embracing an older woman who shared her same brown eyes. "Mom," she murmured, brushing her fingers across the glass of the frame. The contrast between that image and the current reality was heartbreaking. Margaret Thompson, once a vivacious and loving woman, now wandered the halls of the mansion, lost in the labyrinths of her mind, a victim of Alzheimer's that advanced without mercy. Emily set the glass on the desk and headed to the dining room. Her steps echoed in the wide hallways, accentuating the loneliness that permeated every corner of that luxurious prison. The dining room, with its long mahogany table capable of seating 20, seemed to mock her. A single plate awaited her at the head, accompanied by silver cutlery and a crystal glass. "Do you need anything else, miss?" asked Carmen, while serving dinner. "No, thank you, Carmen. You may retire." When the housekeeper left, Emily looked at the plate in front of her. Despite the exquisiteness of the dish prepared by one of the best chefs in the city, she felt no appetite. Her mind wandered, as it did every night, through memories of better times. She remembered the family dinners of her childhood, full of laughter and conversations. Her father, Robert Thompson, always told anecdotes about his business, while her mother listened attentively, occasionally interrupting with witty comments that made everyone laugh. Now silence was her only company. Emily picked at her food without enthusiasm, more out of habit than hunger. When she finished, she got up and headed to her mother's room. Margaret was sitting by the window, her gaze lost in the night garden. Emily approached slowly, her heart constricting. "Mom, how are you today?" she asked softly, kneeling beside her. Margaret turned her head slowly, her eyes wandering without really focusing on her daughter. "Who? Ah, yes, the pretty girl," Margaret murmured with an absent smile. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. The pretty girl was how her mother used to call her when she was little. For a moment, a glimmer of hope shone in her heart, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Yes, Mom, it's me, Emily," she responded, taking Margaret's hand in hers. "Emily, pretty name," said Margaret, turning her gaze back to the window. "Have you seen Robert? He should have arrived from work by now." Emily's heart clenched. Her father had passed away 5 years ago, but for Margaret, trapped in the recesses of her fragmented memory, Robert was still alive, perpetually late from work. Dad will be home soon, Mom," Emily lied, holding back tears. "Do you want me to read to you a bit before bed?" Margaret nodded distractedly. Emily took a book from the nightstand and began to read aloud, as she did every night, hoping that the words could somehow penetrate the fog that enveloped her mother's mind. Later, when Margaret finally fell asleep, Emily left the room, closing the door carefully. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, letting the tears flow freely. How was it possible to feel so alone while surrounded by so much? The mansion, the servants, the company. Everything seemed so empty, so meaningless without the love and connection she had once known. Wiping away her tears, Emily headed to her room. Tomorrow would be another day of meetings, important decisions, and overwhelming responsibilities. Another day of pretending to be strong while feeling increasingly empty inside. As she prepared for bed, Emily looked out the window at the forest surrounding the property. The full moon illuminated the trees, creating mysterious shadows. For a moment, she felt the urge to go out, to lose herself among those trees, to escape the golden cage her life had become. She shook her head, dismissing those thoughts. She had responsibilities, a company to run, a mother to care for. She couldn't afford the luxury of dreaming of impossible escapes. She got into bed, aware that sleep would be slow in coming, as always. In the darkness of her room, Emily Thompson, the woman who had everything, felt poorer than ever. What she didn't know was that fate was about to take an unexpected turn. In the heart of the forest under the same moon she contemplated, a small intruder was about to change her life forever. Morning arrived with the first rays of sun, filtering through the silk curtains of Emily's room. She woke to the sound of her alarm, feeling as tired as when she had gone to bed. Another day in, the life of Emily Thompson was beginning. After her morning routine and a quick breakfast, Emily immersed herself in her work. Meeting after meeting filled her schedule. Complex negotiations and crucial decisions for the future of Thompson Enterprises occupied every minute of her day. By the time the sun began to set, Emily felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Miss Emily," Carmen's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Would you like me to serve dinner?" Emily looked out the window of her study. The sky was tinged with orange and purple hues, announcing the end of another exhausting day. "No, Carmen, thank you," Emily replied, rising from her chair. "I think I'll go for a walk." Carmen looked at her with concern. "But miss, it's getting dark. The woods can be dangerous." Emily gave a tired smile. "I'll be fine, Carmen. I need some fresh air." Without waiting for a response, Emily left her study and headed for the mansion's back door. The cool evening air greeted her, bringing with it the scent of pine and damp earth. She breathed deeply, feeling some of the tension leave her body. Her steps took her along a familiar path that wound between the trees. The fading daylight created dancing shadows among the vegetation, giving the forest a mysterious and almost magical air. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to forget her responsibilities, her worries, her loneliness. Here, surrounded by nature, she felt at peace. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence of the forest. Emily stopped, straining her ear. There it was again, a muffled sob, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere nearby, among the bushes. With her heart racing, Emily followed the sound. She pushed aside some branches, and then she saw him. Curled up against the trunk of an old oak tree was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with disheveled dark hair and dirty, torn clothes. He was shivering, hugging himself, with tears running down his dirt-stained cheeks. "Hello?" Emily said softly, trying not to frighten him. "Are you okay?" The boy looked up, his large, frightened eyes fixed on her. For a moment, he seemed about to run away, but something in Emily's expression stopped him. I got lost," the boy murmured between sobs. Emily approached slowly, kneeling in front of him. "Don't worry, everything will be all right. My name is..." "Emily, what's your name?" "Jack," the boy responded, hiccuping. "Nice to meet you, Jack," Emily said with a reassuring smile. "Can you tell me how you got here?" Jack shook his head, new tears forming in his eyes. "I don't know, I was walking, and suddenly I didn't recognize anything. I tried to find my way back, but everything looked the same." Emily's heart ached at the boy's evident distress. Without thinking twice, she extended her hand to him. "Come with me, Jack. I'll take you to a safe and warm place. There we can figure out how to help you get back home." Jack hesitated for a moment, but the cold and fear overcame his distrust. He took Emily's hand and stood up on shaky legs. Together, they set off back to the mansion. Emily noticed that Jack was limping slightly, and without a word, she lifted him into her arms. The boy tensed initially, but soon relaxed, resting his tired head on Emily's shoulder. As they walked, Emily couldn't help but wonder how this boy had ended up so deep in the forest. Where were his parents? How had he ended up so alone and scared in the middle of nowhere? When they arrived at the mansion, Carmen greeted them with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Oh my God, Miss Emily, what happened? Who is this boy?" "Carmen, please prepare a hot bath and some clean clothes," Emily ordered, ignoring the questions, "and tell Maria to prepare something to eat, something light and warm." While Carmen hurried to fulfill her orders, Emily carried Jack to the main living room. She sat him on one of the luxurious sofas and knelt in front of him. "You're safe now, Jack," she assured him in a soft voice. "We're going to get you cleaned up, give you something to eat, and then we'll try to contact your family. Okay?" Jack nodded, weakly, his eyes roaming with amazement at the opulence surrounding him. "This place he murmured, "it's like a real castle." Emily couldn't help but smile at the boy's amazement. "Well, it's not exactly a castle, but I suppose it looks a bit like one." At that moment, Carmen returned to take Jack to the bathroom. Emily remained in the living room, her mind whirling. What was she going to do with this lost boy? How was she going to find his family? While she waited, Emily approached the old grand piano that occupied a corner of the living room. No one had played it in years. Her mother used to sit there for hours, filling the house with beautiful melodies. Now, like so many other things in the mansion, it remained silent, another reminder of all she had lost. Half an hour later, Jack returned to the living room, clean and dressed in clothes that were too big for him, but comfortable. He looked less scared, though still clearly nervous. "Come, Jack," said Emily, guiding him to the table where Maria had laid out a light. "Dinner, you must be hungry." As Jack ate eagerly, Emily observed him, trying to decipher the mystery this boy represented. There was something about him, in the way his eyes scanned the room with a mixture of wonder and melancholy, that seemed strangely familiar to her. "Jack," she began softly, "can you tell me where you live, or the names of your parents?" The boy lowered his gaze, fidgeting with the spoon. I don't know, I don't remember." Emily frowned, concerned. Could he have suffered some kind of trauma that had caused amnesia? Or was there something else behind his apparent memory loss? "It's okay, don't worry," she assured him, placing a hand over his, "We'll figure it out together." At that moment, a sound caught both their attention. Margaret, Emily's mother, had entered the living room, guided by her nurse. Her eyes wandered around the room without focusing on anything in particular until they landed on Jack. "Oh, look," she said in a soft and distant voice. "We have a visitor." Emily quickly stood up, approaching her mother. "Yes, Mom, this is Jack. He'll be staying with us for a while." Margaret smiled vaguely in the boy's direction, before her attention was captured by the piano in the corner. "Music," she murmured. "There used to be music here." Emily felt a pang of pain in her chest. "Yes, Mom, you used to play the piano, remember?" But Margaret had already lost the thread of the conversation, her gaze once again lost in the distance. The nurse gently guided her out of the living room, leaving Emily with a feeling of loss that never seemed to diminish. When she turned back to Jack, she noticed that the boy was looking at the piano with curiosity. "Do you like music, Jack?" she asked, trying to keep the sadness out of her voice. To her surprise, the boy's eyes lit up. "I love it," he said with the first hint of enthusiasm Emily had seen in him. "Can I?" He timidly pointed towards the piano. Emily nodded. Intrigued, Jack got up and approached the instrument with a mixture of reverence and excitement. He sat on the bench, his feet barely touching the floor, and for a moment simply caressed the keys with his small fingers, and then, to Emily's absolute amazement, he began to play. The melody that emerged from the piano was beautiful and complex, far beyond what one would expect from a child his age. Jack's fingers moved with grace and confidence over the keys, creating music that filled the mansion in a way that hadn't happened in years. Emily stood paralyzed, unable to believe what she was witnessing. Who was this boy? Where did he come from? And above all, how was it possible that he could play like that? As Jack's music continued to fill the air, Emily felt something stirring inside her, a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Without her knowing, in another part of the mansion, Margaret Thompson stopped in the middle of the hallway, her usually absent face showing a flash of recognition. For a brief moment, her eyes cleared, and a genuine smile appeared on her lips. Jack's music was awakening something, not just in Emily, but in the entire Thompson mansion. And this was just the beginning. The days following Jack's arrival brought a series of changes. To the Thompson mansion, Emily, accustomed to her solitary routine, suddenly found herself with the responsibility of caring for a child. Although she had informed the authorities about Jack, the lack of information about his origin made it difficult to search for his family. "Miss Emily," said Carmen one morning while serving breakfast, "don't you think we should consider other options for the boy? Perhaps a temporary home?" Emily looked up from her coffee, frowning. "No, Carmen, Jack stays here until we find his family." The firmness in her voice surprised even Emily. In the few days he had been there, Jack had brought a spark of life to the mansion that she didn't want to lose. "As you wish, miss," replied Carmen, though Emily could see the concern in her eyes. Later that day, as Emily worked in her study, the sound of the piano once again filled the house. It had become a common occurrence since Jack's arrival. The boy spent hours sitting at the instrument, playing melodies that ranged from simple children's songs to complex pieces that Emily couldn't believe someone so young could interpret. Setting aside her documents, Emily headed to the main living room. There she found Jack, completely absorbed in the music, his small fingers flying over the keys with amazing skill. "That's beautiful, Jack," said Emily when the piece ended. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Jack shrugged. A gesture that Emily had learned meant he didn't remember or didn't want to talk about it. "I just know," replied the boy, his eyes fixed on the piano keys. Emily sat next to him on the bench. "You know, my mother used to play the piano. She filled the house with music every day." "And she doesn't play anymore?" asked Jack, curious. Emily felt a pang of pain in her chest. "No, not anymore. She's sick and she doesn't remember how to do it." Jack nodded, as if he perfectly understood what it meant to lose memories. For a moment both remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. "Can I play for her?" Jack suddenly asked. "Maybe the music will help her remember." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. "Sure, Jack, I think she would like that." That afternoon, Emily brought her mother to the main living room. Margaret walked slowly, leaning on her walker, her gaze wandering aimlessly around the room. "Mom," Emily said softly, "Jack is going to play the piano for you." Margaret showed no signs of having heard, but she allowed herself to be guided to an armchair near the piano. Jack, seated in front of the instrument, waited until Emily gave him a gesture to begin. The first notes of a soft melody filled the air. Emily watched her mother, hoping to see some reaction. At first, Margaret remained motionless, her gaze lost in the distance. But as the music continued, something seemed to change. Slowly, Margaret's eyes focused on Jack. Her hands, usually restless, remained still on her lap. And then, to Emily's amazement, a tear rolled down her mother's cheek. "That song," Margaret murmured, her voice clearer than Emily had heard it in years. "I remember it." Emily knelt beside her mother, taking her hands in hers. "What do you remember, Mom?" Margaret blinked, as if trying to catch a fleeting memory. "I used to play it for you when you were little." Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was true. Now she remembered that melody had been her lullaby, the one her mother played every night before bed. How is it possible that Jack knows it? Emily wondered aloud. As the music continued, Margaret began to hum softly, following the melody. Her eyes, usually clouded by confusion, seemed clearer, more present. "Emily, my pretty girl," Margaret suddenly said, looking directly at her daughter. "Why are you crying?" Emily hadn't realized that tears were running down her cheeks. "I'm happy, Mom," she replied, gently, squeezing Margaret's hands. "Very happy." When the song ended, a silence filled with emotion filled the room. Jack turned on the piano bench, his large, expectant eyes fixed on Margaret and Emily. "You play very well, little one," said Margaret, surprising everyone. "You remind me of someone—" Her voice trailed off, the memory escaping before she could catch it. "Thank you, ma'am," Jack replied shyly. "I'm glad you liked it." Emily stood up, wiping away her tears. "Jack, that was wonderful. How did you know that song?" The boy shrugged again, a gesture that Emily was beginning to associate with the mysteries of his past. I don't know, it was just in my head. That night, after putting Jack to bed and making sure her mother was comfortable, Emily retired to her study. Her mind was spinning, trying to understand what had happened. How was it possible that Jack knew such a personal song, one that her mother used to play for her? Moved by an impulse, Emily went to an old cabinet in the corner of her study. There, in dusty boxes, she kept old photo albums and family mementos. She began to flip through one of the albums, looking for something, though she wasn't sure what. That's when she saw it. An old photograph, taken more than 30 years ago. In it, a young Margaret held a baby in her arms, while another young woman was seated at the piano. Emily had never paid much attention to that photo before, but now something about it caught her attention. The woman at the piano there was something familiar about her face. Emily squinted, trying to remember where she had seen her before. And then, like lightning, realization struck her. The eyes, the shape of the nose, they were incredibly similar to Jack's. With her heart racing, Emily looked for the name written on the back of the photo. Sarah, 1990. Sarah, Emily murmured, the name sounding vaguely familiar. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in her mind, her father mentioning a young employee named Sarah, a talented pianist who had worked for the family briefly before disappearing without a trace. Emily collapsed into her chair, the photograph trembling in her hands. Could it be? Did Jack have some connection to this mysterious Sarah from the past? Questions swirled in her mind. Who was Jack, really? How had he ended up in the woods near the mansion? And why did he know a song so intimately linked to her family? Emily looked at the clock. It was late, but she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep with all these unanswered questions. She needed to talk to someone who could shed light on this mystery. With determination, she stood up. There was one person who had been working in the mansion long enough to remember Sarah. Someone who might be able to help her unravel this enigma. Carmen, Emily called, leaving her study. I need to talk to you now. As she headed to the kitchen, where she knew she would find Carmen, Emily felt she was on the brink of a discovery that could change everything. What she didn't know was how deeply this mystery was intertwined with her own family history, and how its resolution would shake the foundations of everything she believed she knew about her past. Emily found Carmen in the kitchen, cleaning the last dishes from dinner. The older woman looked up, surprised by her employer's sudden appearance at this hour of the night. "Miss Emily, is something wrong?" asked Carmen, drying her hands on her apron. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "Carmen, I need you to tell me the truth about something. It's important." Carmen frowned but nodded. "Of course, miss. What is it about?" Emily placed the photograph on the kitchen table. "Who is this woman? The one sitting at the piano?" Carmen's eyes widened as she saw the image. A shadow of recognition, mixed with something that seemed to be concern, crossed her face. "That's Sarah, miss," Carmen replied after a moment of hesitation. "She worked here many years ago, before you were born." "What do you know about her, Carmen?" Emily pressed. "Please, it's very important." Carmen slowly sat down, her eyes never leaving the photograph. Sarah was a very talented young woman. She played the piano like the angels. Your mother, Mrs. Margaret, adored her. They used to spend hours together in the living room, playing and singing. Emily listened attentively, trying to connect the pieces of the puzzle. What happened to her? Why did she leave? Carmen seemed to hesitate, as if she were internally struggling over how much she should reveal. "It was a long time ago, Miss Sarah. She had to leave suddenly. Nobody really knew why." "Carmen," said Emily, her voice firm but pleading, "I need to know the truth. It has to do with Jack, I'm sure." At the mention of the boy's name, Carmen visibly paled. "Jack? What does that boy have to do with all this?" Emily took another photograph from her pocket, this time one she had taken of Jack recently. She placed it next to the image of Sarah. "Look, Carmen. Don't you see the resemblance?" Carmen gasped, her eyes moving between the two photographs. "Oh my God," she murmured. "Carmen, please," Emily insisted. "I need to know what really happened with Sarah." The older woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was determination in her gaze. "Miss Emily, what I'm about to tell you is something I swore I would never reveal, but I suppose the time has come for the truth to come to light." Emily leaned forward, her heart beating hard in anticipation. Carmen began to speak, her voice low and charged with emotion. "Sarah wasn't just an employee. She became a close friend of your mother. They spent a lot of time together, especially when your father was away on business trips." Emily nodded, vaguely remembering having heard mentions of Sarah in her parents' conversations years ago. "One day," Carmen continued, "Sarah came to me very upset she was pregnant." Emily felt her breath catch. "Pregnant? By whom?" Carmen lowered her gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "By Mr. Robert, your father." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Emily remained motionless, trying to process what she had just heard. My father," she finally managed to say. Carmen nodded sadly. It was a very difficult time. Sarah was devastated. She felt betrayed and scared. She didn't know what to do. "What happened next?" Emily asked, though she feared the answer. "Your father, he wanted Sarah to leave, to disappear," said Carmen, disapproval clear in her voice. "He offered her money to go away and never come back, but Sarah refused. She loved her baby and didn't want to abandon it." Emily felt her head spinning. Everything she believed she knew about her family, about her father, was crumbling. "And my mother, did she know?" Carmen shook her head. "Not at that time. Sarah didn't want to hurt her, but one night your mother overheard them arguing. She found out everything." Emily closed her eyes, imagining the pain and betrayal her mother must have felt. "What did my mother do?" she asked quietly. "Surprisingly, she supported Sarah," Carmen replied. "Your mother always had a kind heart. She was hurt, of course, but she didn't blame Sarah. Instead, she confronted your father." Emily opened her eyes, surprised. She had never imagined her mother, always so docile and compliant, confronting her dominant father. "It was a terrible night," Carmen continued. "There was shouting, crying. Your father was furious. He threatened to leave everything, to abandon the family if your mother insisted on supporting Sarah." "And then what happened?" Emily pressed. Though she feared the answer, Carmen sighed deeply. "Sarah disappeared the next day. She left in the middle of the night, without saying goodbye to anyone. Your mother was heartbroken. She tried to search for her but had no success. Your father forbade Sarah's name from being mentioned in the house again." Emily stood up from the chair, unable to remain seated. She walked to the window, looking out at the darkness of the garden as she tried to assimilate all this information. "Carmen," she finally said, her voice trembling, "do you think Jack could be Sarah and your father's son?" Carmen finished for her. "Yes, miss, I think it's very possible." Emily turned to look at Carmen, unshed tears shining in her eyes. "That would mean that Jack is your half-brother," Carmen confirmed softly. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with emotions and revelations that threatened to overwhelm Emily. Everything she believed she knew about her family, about her childhood, about herself, was being questioned. "Why did you never tell me, Carmen?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carmen stood up, approaching Emily with an expression of deep regret. "I'm so sorry, miss. I made a promise to your mother. She wanted to protect you, to protect the family, but now—" She looked towards the door as if she could see Jack through it. "Now it seems that the past has found a way to come back to us." Emily nodded slowly, trying to process everything. Her mind was full of questions. Where had Sarah been all these years? How had Jack ended up alone in the forest? And what did all this mean for the future? "I need time to think," Emily finally said. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Carmen. Please don't say anything to Jack yet. I need to figure out how to handle this." Carmen nodded, concern evident on her face. "Of course, Miss Will. You be all right?" Emily gave a weak smile. "I will be. I just need time." As she left the kitchen, Emily felt the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. The truth she had just discovered threatened to change everything she knew. But amidst the confusion and pain, one thought persisted. Jack, the boy who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who had brought music and joy back to the mansion, was her brother. With slow steps, Emily headed to Jack's room. She stopped at the door, watching the boy sleep peacefully, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions and revelations surrounding him. "I promise I'm going to protect you," Emily whispered, though she knew Jack couldn't hear her. "I'm going to find out what happened, and I'm going to make things right for you, for Sarah, for all of us." As she gently closed the door, Emily knew that the path ahead would be difficult. She would have to face her family's past, her father's decisions, her mother's pain. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a clear purpose. Jack's music had awakened more than memories in the Thompson mansion. It had unearthed long-buried secrets, and with them, the possibility of redemption and a new chance to heal old wounds. Emily headed to her room, knowing that sleep wouldn't come easily that night. She had much to think about, much to plan. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also the promise of answers and perhaps of a reunited family. The days following Carmen's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Emily. She found herself divided between the shock of discovering the truth about her father, concern for Jack, and uncertainty about how to proceed. Every time she looked at the boy, she saw not only the little one she had come to love, but also the living reminder of her family's secrets. One morning, as Emily was having her coffee on the terrace watching Jack play in the garden, Carmen approached with a worried expression. "Miss Emily," she began cautiously, "have you thought about what you're going to do regarding the situation?" Emily sighed, setting her cup on the table. "I can't stop thinking about it, Carmen, but it's complicated. I can't just tell Jack that I'm his sister, that his mother disappeared years ago, and that his father—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Carmen nodded understandingly. "I understand, miss, but perhaps there's someone else you should talk to first." Emily looked at her questioningly. "Your mother," Carmen said softly. "Maybe she can shed more light on what really happened." Emily tensed at the suggestion. The idea of confronting her mother with this secret from the past terrified her. What if it worsened her condition? What if it confused her even more? "I don't know, Carmen," Emily replied, doubt evident in her voice. "The Alzheimer's. I don't know if it's a good idea to stir up the past." "I understand your concern, miss," Carmen said gently. "But I've noticed that since Jack arrived, since he started playing the piano, your mother seems more present. Perhaps the music is awakening something in her." Emily reflected on Carmen's words. It was true that Margaret had had more frequent moments of lucidity since Jack's arrival. The music seemed to have an almost magical effect on her. "Maybe you're right," Emily finally conceded. "I'll think about it." That afternoon, while Jack was practicing on the piano, Emily decided to bring her mother to the living room. Margaret walked slowly, leaning on her daughter's arm, her gaze wandering the hallway, with the usual confusion. Upon entering the living room, Jack's music filled the air. It was a soft, almost melancholic melody. Margaret stopped, her eyes suddenly focusing. "That song," she murmured. "I know it." Emily felt her heart skip a beat. "Do you remember it, Mom?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Sarah used to play it. It was her favorite." Emily held her breath. It was the first time in years that her mother had mentioned Sarah on her own initiative. "Mom," Emily said softly, guiding Margaret to an armchair, "can you tell me about Sarah?" For a moment, Margaret seemed confused, as if she didn't understand the question. But then, as Jack's music continued, something seemed to clear in her gaze. "Sarah was like a daughter to me," Margaret began, her voice firmer than Emily had heard it in a long time. "So talented, so full of life, she filled this house with music and joy." Emily listened attentively, afraid to interrupt this rare moment of clarity. "But then," Margaret continued, her expression darkening, "there was sadness, so much pain." "What happened, Mom?" Emily asked gently. Margaret closed her eyes, as if reliving a painful memory. "Your father, he made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and Sarah, my poor Sarah." Emily took her mother's hands in hers. "What happened to Sarah, Mum?" "She left," Margaret replied, a tear rolling down her cheek. She took her baby and left. I wanted her to stay. I wanted to help her, but she said she couldn't, that it was too painful. Emily felt a lump forming in her throat. Did you know where she went? Margaret shook her head. I never knew. I tried to find her, but... Her voice trailed off, confusion clouding her gaze again. At that moment, Jack finished playing. The sudden silence seemed to pull Margaret. Out of her trance, she looked around, disoriented. Emily, what are we doing here? Emily took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions. Nothing, Mom. We were just listening to music. As she helped her mother return to her room, Emily felt her mind spinning. Margaret's words had confirmed Carmen's story, but they had also raised new questions. Where had Sarah gone? Why had she never tried to contact them? That night, after putting Jack to bed, Emily locked herself in her study. She pulled out old boxes of documents, searching for any clue that might lead her to Sarah. Bills, letters, old contracts, anything that might give her an idea of where to look. As she went through the papers, a yellowed envelope fell to the floor. Emily picked it up, noticing it was sealed on the front. In her mother's elegant handwriting was written, "For Emily, when the time comes." With trembling hands, Emily opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a small key. "My dear Emily," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it's because the past has found a way to reach us. There are things you need to know, truths I've kept for too long." Emily collapsed into her chair. Absorbing every word of her mother's letter, Margaret had foreseen that this day would come and had left instructions, explanations, and most importantly, an address. The last line of the letter made Emily's heart race. "Find Sarah. She has the answers you need. And remember, love can heal even the deepest wounds." Emily looked at the small key that accompanied the letter. She knew it was the first step towards the truth, towards resolving the mysteries surrounding her family. With determination, she picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Arthur, it's Emily Thompson I need. Your help to find someone..." As she explained the situation to Arthur, her old friend and private detective, Emily felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. She was about to embark on a journey that could change everything, a journey into a past full of secrets and towards an uncertain future. She looked towards the door of her study, thinking of Jack sleeping at the end of the hallway. "I'm going to uncover the truth," she promised herself. "For you, for Sarah, for all of us." What Emily didn't know was that her actions were about to trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of her world and bring to light secrets even deeper than she had ever imagined. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Emily. While waiting for news from Arthur, she immersed herself in the task of unraveling her family's past. Every night, after Jack went to sleep, Emily spent hours in her study, reviewing old documents, photographs, and letters. One afternoon, while Jack was practicing on the piano, Emily's phone rang. It was Arthur. "Emily, I think I've found her," he said without preamble. "Sarah Miller. She lives in a small town a few hours from the city." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure," Arthur replied. "The details match. She works as a music teacher at the local school. And there's something else." He paused. "She has a son." Emily closed her eyes, trying to process the information. "Thank you, Arthur. Send me the address. I'll go myself." After hanging up, Emily remained motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. Finally, she headed to the living room where Jack was still playing. "Jack," she said softly, interrupting his practice, "I need to talk to you." The boy looked at her. Curiously, "Is something wrong, Emily?" "No, sweetheart," she replied, sitting next to him on the piano bench. "But I have to make an important trip. It will only be for a day or two." Jack lowered his gaze, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the keys. "Are you going to look for my family?" The question took Emily by surprise. "Why do you think that?" Jack shrugged. "I heard Carmen talking on the phone. She said something about finding someone." Emily took a deep breath. She knew she had to be careful with her words. "Jack, do you remember anything about your mother?" The boy frowned, concentrating. Sometimes I dream of a woman playing the piano. Her music is beautiful, but when I try to see her face, it fades away." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. "Jack, I'm going to look for someone who might know more about you and your family. I promise that when I return, I'll tell you everything I find out. Is that okay? Jack nodded slowly. Can I keep playing the piano while you're gone? Emily smiled, hugging him. Of course you can. Your music is a gift to everyone in this house. The next day, Emily found herself driving down a rural road, her mind full of questions and fears. How would Sarah react to seeing her? What would she tell her about Jack? Finally, she arrived at a picturesque small town. Following Arthur's directions, she stopped in front of a modest two-story house with a well-tended garden. On the porch, there was an upright piano. With her heart beating strongly, Emily approached the door and rang the doorbell. A few moments that seemed eternal passed before the door opened. In front of her stood a woman in her 50s, with dark hair streaked with grey and familiar eyes that widened in surprise at seeing her. "Emily," the woman whispered, her voice a mixture of shock and recognition. "Sarah," Emily replied, feeling her legs tremble. "We need to talk." Sarah nodded slowly, stepping aside to let her in. The interior of the house was filled with photographs and musical scores. Emily couldn't help but notice that there were no images of Jack. They sat in the living room, an uncomfortable silence filling the space between them. "How did you find me?" Sarah finally asked. "That doesn't matter now," Emily replied, deciding to get straight to the point. "Sarah, Jack is with me." The color drained from Sarah's face. "What? How?" "I found him in the woods near the mansion a few weeks ago," Emily explained. "He was alone, scared. He didn't remember anything about his past or his family." Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, tears forming in her eyes. "Oh my God, my little boy." "What happened, Sarah?" Emily asked softly. "Why was Jack alone in the woods?" Sarah took a shaky breath before beginning to speak. "A month ago, Jack and I had a car accident near the Thompson estate. It was my fault. I got distracted for a moment and lost control of the vehicle. When I woke up in the hospital, Jack had disappeared. The police searched for days, but they couldn't find him. I thought I had lost him forever." Emily listened, feeling a mixture of compassion and confusion. "But why were you near the mansion?" After all this time, Sarah lowered her gaze, her hands twisting in her lap. "I had decided it was time to face the past, to tell Jack the truth about his father, about his family. I thought that maybe it was time to come back." "Why did you leave, Sarah?" Emily asked, the question that had been burning inside her for weeks. "My mother, she wanted to help you." Sarah looked up, her eyes full of pain and regret. "Your mother was kinder than I deserved, but I couldn't stay, Emily. Not after what happened with your father. The guilt, the shame, it was too much." "But abandoning your son," Emily began, but Sarah interrupted her. "I never abandoned him," she exclaimed fiercely. "Jack is my life. I've dedicated every moment to taking care of him, teaching him music, trying to be a good mother. When he disappeared, I felt like my world was ending." Emily nodded slowly, trying to process all this information. "Sarah, Jack is fine. He's safe at the mansion, but he needs his mother." Sarah looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. Do you think I could see him?" "Of course," Emily replied without hesitation. "But before that, there's something else you need to know." And so, Emily told Sarah about Margaret's condition, about how Jack's music seemed to awaken memories in her. She told her about Carmen's revelations and the letter her mother had left. When she finished, both women sat in silence, the weight of 2 decades of secrets and separation between them. "I never meant to cause so much pain," Sarah finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I just wanted to protect Jack, to give him a normal life away from all the drama and secrets." Emily took Sarah's hand. "I understand, but now we have the chance to make things right, to bring our family back together." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're right. It's time to face the past and think about the future. For Jack." As they prepared to return together to the Thompson mansion, Emily couldn't help but feel a mixture of anxiety and hope. She knew that what was to come wouldn't be easy. There would be tears, difficult explanations, and old wounds to heal, but there was also the promise of a new beginning, of a reunited family. What Emily didn't know was that the reunion between Sarah and Jack would trigger a series of events that would reveal even deeper secrets, secrets that would forever change the history of the Thompson family. The journey back to the Thompson mansion was silent, laden with contained emotions and unasked questions. Emily drove, occasionally glancing at Sarah, who kept her gaze fixed on the landscape rapidly passing by the window. When they finally reached the imposing iron gates of the property, Sarah let out a shaky sigh. "So many years have passed," she murmured, "and yet it feels like yesterday when I left." Emily parked the car in front of the main entrance. "Sarah," she said softly, "are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded, though apprehension was evident on her face. "I have to be for Jack." They entered the mansion, the echo of their footsteps resonating in the foyer. Carmen appeared immediately, her eyes widening in surprise at seeing Sarah. "My goodness," the housekeeper whispered. "Sarah, it really is you." Sarah gave a timid smile. "Hello, Carmen. It's been a long time." Before they could say more, the sound of the piano filled the air. The melody, soft and melancholic, seemed to float from the main living room. "It's Jack," Emily said, noticing how Sarah tensed at the sound. "Do you want—" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. They followed the sound to the living room, where they found Jack sitting at the piano, completely absorbed in his music. For a moment, no one moved. Sarah watched her son. Silent tears running down her cheeks, Emily could see the longing, love, and fear mixed in the woman's expression. Finally, as if sensing someone else's presence, Jack stopped playing and turned around. His eyes fell first on Emily, then on the stranger standing beside her. "Jack," Emily said softly, "there's someone I want you to meet." Sarah stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello, my love." Jack stared at her intently, a spark of recognition shining in his eyes. You're the woman from my dreams, the one who plays the piano." Sarah choked back a sob, nodding. "Yes, sweetheart, it's me, I'm your mum." For a moment, Jack seemed frozen in place. Then slowly he got up from the piano bench and approached Sarah. He raised a hand, gently touching his mother's face, as if wanting to make sure she was real. "Mom," he murmured, and suddenly he threw himself into Sarah's arms. The room filled with tears and laughter, intermingled as mother and son embraced, years of separation dissolving in this moment of reunion. Emily watched, the scene with a mixture of joy and a touch of sadness. She was happy for Jack, but she couldn't help feeling a pang of loss. In the past few weeks, she had grown deeply fond of the boy. As mother and son reunited, a movement at the living room door caught Emily's attention. Margaret was there, leaning on her walker, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. "Mom," Emily said, approaching her, "what are you doing here?" Margaret didn't respond. Immediately, her gaze remained fixed on Sarah and Jack. "The music," she finally murmured. "It brought me here." At that moment, Sarah looked up and saw Margaret. The color drained from her face. "Mrs. Margaret," she said, her voice trembling. Margaret blinked, as if coming out of a trance. Her eyes focused on Sarah, and for a moment she seemed confused. Then, to everyone's surprise, a smile spread across her face. "Sarah, my girl," Margaret said, her voice clearer than Emily had heard it in years. "You've come back." Sarah slowly stood up, Jack still clinging to her hand. "Yes, Mum, I've come back." Margaret extended a shaky hand towards Sarah. "I knew you would. I always knew you'd come home." Emily watched the scene in amazement. Her mother seemed more lucid than ever, as if Sarah's presence and Jack's music had cleared the fog of Alzheimer's, if only momentarily. "Mom," Emily said softly, "do you remember Jack?" Margaret looked at the boy, her smile widening. "Of course I do. The little pianist, he has his mother's fingers and his father's eyes." The mention of Jack's father fell like a bomb in the room. Sarah visibly tensed, while Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. "Mrs. Margaret," Sarah began, but Margaret interrupted her. "No, dear, no more secrets," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly firm. It's time for the truth to come to light, the whole truth. Emily looked at her mother with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. What do you mean, Mom? Margaret took a deep breath, as if gathering strength. There's something everyone needs to know. Something I've kept for far too long. The room fell silent, the tension palpable in the air. Jack looked at the adults with confusion, not fully understanding what was happening. Margaret straightened up as much as she could, her gaze sweeping over the faces of everyone present. The night Sarah left, she began, something else happened, something that changed everything. Emily felt her heart beating hard. What else could there be? What secret could be so big that her mother had kept it all these years? Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if reliving a painful memory. When she opened them again, there was determination in her gaze. Robert is not Jack's father, she finally said. The revelation fell like lightning in the room. Sarah gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. Emily remained motionless, trying to process what she had just heard. But how? Emily finally managed to say, "We thought, Dad." Margaret shook her head. Everyone assumed it, even Sarah, but the truth is much more complicated. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale. "Mrs. Margaret, I don't understand. Who is Jack's father then?" Margaret looked at Sarah with a mixture of compassion and regret. Jack's father is someone we all knew well, someone who was always close, but whom no one suspected. Emily felt the world spinning around her. Who else could be Jack's father? And why had her mother kept this secret for so long? Margaret took another deep breath, preparing to reveal the last and most shocking secret. "Of all Jack's father," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper, "is my brother your Uncle Richard, Emily." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Emily felt like she couldn't breathe. Sarah had collapsed into a chair, her face a mask of shock and confusion. Jack looked at everyone, his eyes wide and frightened. "But how is that possible?" Emily finally managed to say, "Uncle Richard, he never—" Margaret nodded, slowly. "It's a long and complicated story, a story of forbidden love, secrets and sacrifices, and it's time for everyone to know it." As Margaret prepared to tell the full story, Emily couldn't help but feel that the world she knew was crumbling around her. Each revelation seemed to open the door to more questions, more secrets, and in the midst of all this was Jack, an innocent child whose existence had triggered this avalanche of hidden truths. Emily looked around, at her mother, at Sarah, at Jack. She knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. The truth, so long buried, would finally come to light, and with it would come consequences that none of them could foresee. The living room of the Thompson mansion, once the scene of elegant parties and family gatherings, was now witness to a very different kind of meeting. Margaret, seated in her favorite armchair, looked at the shocked faces surrounding her. Emily, her daughter, whose world had just been shaken to its foundations. Sarah, the woman who had carried a secret she didn't even fully know. And Jack, the boy whose existence had unearthed decades of hidden truths. "Mom," Emily began, her voice trembling, "please explain to us. How is it possible that Uncle Richard is Jack's father?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to tell a long-buried story. "It all began more than 30 years ago," Margaret started, her voice surprisingly firm. "Richard, my younger brother, was always the rebel of the family. While I married young to Robert and assumed the role expected of me, Richard traveled the world pursuing his dreams of being a musician." Sarah listened intently, her eyes fixed on Margaret. Jack had curled up next to his mother, sensing the tension in the air, but not fully understanding what was happening. "When Richard finally returned home," Margaret continued, "he met Sarah. It was love at first sight. But things were complicated. Our family had expectations, traditions. A wandering musician wasn't considered a good match." Emily frowned. "But what about Dad? We thought he and Sarah—" Margaret shook her head. "Robert and Sarah never had a relationship. That was a lie I created to protect everyone." Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in surprise. You lied for me." Margaret nodded slowly. "Richard and you loved each other deeply, but I knew my family would never approve. When we discovered you were pregnant, Richard wanted to face everyone, to fight for your love. But her voice broke. I was afraid of what might happen, of how it would affect the family business, our reputation. Emily felt her head spinning. Her entire life, everything she believed she knew about her family, was crumbling before her eyes. "What did you do, Mom?" she asked quietly. Margaret took a deep breath. "I convinced Richard to leave. I told him it was best for Sarah, for the baby. That if he stayed, our family would destroy everything. And then I let everyone believe that Robert was the father." Sarah stood up abruptly, tears running down her cheeks. "Why? Why did you let me believe I had betrayed my best friend? Why didn't you tell me the truth about Richard?" "Because I was a coward," Margaret replied, her voice laden with remorse. "Because I thought I was protecting everyone, but I only caused more pain." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with emotions contained for decades. Jack, sensing his mother's sadness, clung to her more tightly. "Where is Richard now?" Emily finally asked. Margaret shook her head sadly. "I don't know. After he left, he cut all contact with us. I've tried to find him over the years, but—" "I know where he is," interrupted a voice from the living room door. Everyone turned to see Carmen, who had been listening silently. The elderly housekeeper stepped forward slowly, pulling an envelope from her apron. "Richard has been sending me letters for years," Carmen explained. "He asked me to keep them, not to tell anyone. But I think it's time everyone knows the truth." Emily took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a recent letter and a photograph. In the image, a man with graying hair and familiar eyes smiled at the camera, a piano visible in the background. "It's him," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the photograph. "It's Richard." Jack approached, curious. Is that my dad?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Emily began to read the letter aloud. "Dear Carmen, I hope this letter finds you well. So many years have passed, and yet not a day goes by that I don't think of the family I left behind, of Sarah, of the son I never knew. I know I was wrong to leave, to let the lies continue, but the pain of thinking I had lost Sarah, that my own nephew was actually my son, it was too much. I've spent the last few years teaching music at a small conservatory in Italy. Music has been my solace, my way of feeling connected to the past I left behind. But I'm tired of running, tired of the secrets and lies. It's time to face the truth, to try to repair the damage I caused with my silence. I'll be coming home soon. I only hope it's not too late to ask for forgiveness, to try to rebuild what was broken so many years ago. With love, Richard." When Emily finished reading, the room fell silent. Margaret wept silently, years of guilt and regret reflected on her face. Sarah hugged Jack, her emotions a mixture of shock, relief, and anticipation. "He's coming back," Emily murmured, still processing everything she had discovered. "Uncle Richard, Jack's father, he's coming back." As if on cue, the sound of the front door's doorbell resonated through the mansion. Everyone looked at each other, a mixture of fear and hope in their eyes. Carmen hurried to open the door. Moments later, footsteps approached the living room, and there in the threshold stood Richard Thompson. The years had silvered his hair and left lines on his face, but his eyes, the same eyes Jack had inherited, shone with contained emotion. "Sarah," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the woman he had loved for decades. Sarah slowly stood up, Jack still clinging to her hand. "Richard," she responded, her voice barely a whisper. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if pushed by an invisible force, Sarah and Richard melted into an embrace, years of separation and longing dissolving. In that instant, Jack watched them with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Richard gently separated from Sarah and knelt in front of the boy. "Hello, Jack," he said, his voice charged with emotion. I'm your father." Jack looked at his mother, who nodded through tears, and then back at Richard slowly. He extended his hand and touched his father's face, as he had done with Sarah days earlier. "You have the same eyes as me," Jack said simply. Richard laughed softly, tears running down his cheeks. "Yes, that's right." Margaret rose from her armchair, leaning on Emily. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling. "Brother, I'm so sorry." Richard stood up, facing his sister. For a moment, the tension in the air was palpable. Then, to everyone's surprise, Richard hugged Margaret. "I'm sorry too," he said. "I'm sorry I ran away, that I let you carry all of this alone." Emily watched the scene, feeling her heart fill with an emotion she couldn't name. It was as if all the pieces of a long, incomplete puzzle were finally falling into place. "There's so much to say, so much to explain," Richard said, looking at everyone present. "But first, there's something I need to..." So he approached the piano, the instrument that had been a silent witness to so many crucial moments in the Thompson family's history. His fingers caressed the keys reverently. "This is a song I composed years ago," he explained. "A song about lost love, family, and the hope of reunion." And then Richard began to play. The melody that filled the room was beautiful and melancholic, laden with years of repressed emotions. But as it progressed, it transformed, becoming brighter, more hopeful. Jack, as if drawn by an invisible force, approached the piano. Without a word, he began to play alongside his father, his small hands perfectly complementing Richard's melody. Sarah, Emily, and Margaret watched in wonder as father and son, separated for years, connected through music. It was as if all the lies, secrets, and pain of the past were dissolving into this beautiful symphony of reconciliation. As the music filled the Thompson mansion, Emily felt something change in the air. The ghosts of the past, the shadows of long-kept secrets, seemed to fade with each note. She looked around at her mother, whose face reflected a peace she hadn't seen in years, at Sarah, whose tears were now of joy, at Richard and Jack united in music, and she knew deep in her heart that although the path to healing would be long, they had taken the first step. The Thompson mansion, which for so long had been a place of secrets and silences, now resonated with the promise of a new beginning, a symphony of forgiveness, love, and hope that would mark the start of a new chapter in their lives. As the last note faded into the air, Emily knew that finally they had found the melody that would guide them towards the future. A future where secrets would no longer have a place, where love and truth would prevail over fear and lies. And so, in the heart of the Thompson mansion, a new story began to be written. A story of redemption, of second chances, and of the unbreakable strength of family love.